Mary and Kevin Firmin were married in 1939 and moved into a picturesque cottage that was located in a small Yorkshire village in northern England. They'd only been married for 16 years when Kevin developed throat cancer that was terminal, and after a long and painful illness, died on Christmas Eve 1955. Mary was now alone with a 14-year-old son to support and felt that life would now be difficult without her beloved partner. As each year passed, Mary dreaded Christmas Eve, and people would regularly invite her around to their house. But Mary felt it was a kind of duty to stay at home in the cottage and reminisce about the happy years they'd spent together, as short as they were. However, one year, only 2 weeks before Christmas, Mary decided that this year she would not spend Christmas alone, and put an end to her yearly self-exile. Her husband had now been gone for 13 years, and it was time to move on. This year, she would spend Christmas Eve with her sister Joan, and then spend Christmas with her son Michael, who was now 27 years old and married with 6-year-old twins. She then visited her sister Joan, who lived in the same village, and told her the good news that she would be spending Christmas Eve with her. Joan was ecstatic with her sister's decision, and like her sister, was also a widow, who had for many years had to also bring her son up alone. Joan had a 13-year-old son called Gordon, but unlike Michael, seemed a confirmed bachelor who lived at home with his mother. When Gordon heard that his auntie would be staying with them, he too was excited and offered to pick her up on Christmas Eve. After they had had lunch, Joan offered to walk back with her sister to the cottage, as she was going in that direction and wanted to visit the shops. The weather outside was freezing cold, as the sisters had to hold on to each other in case one should slip on the icy pavement. As they came to a bend in the road, Mary suddenly had an unnerving sensation of a loud buzzing in her ears, but after a couple of minutes it thankfully passed. As they turned the bend, they came upon the village church, where her husband Kevin was buried, and in the dark, bleak weather it had a strange, surreal appearance about it. Mary then felt entranced as she stared at the church and then looked at the stone wall that surrounded it. It felt to Mary as if time was standing still, and then let out a sudden gasp and quickly grabbed her sister's arm. Joan then looked at her sister, concerned about her health, but all Mary could do was shake her head. Joan looked across at a cafe and quickly ushered her sister into the small shop. As Mary was seated near the window, she then rubbed off the condensation and peered out at the church and the stone wall. She was relieved she could no longer see the apparitions that had suddenly appeared to her when she was outside with her sister. Mary would never forget what he's just seen, and in the years that her husband had been gone, often wished that he would appear to her, or at least make his presence felt, but he never did. But after all these years, she suddenly sees him, and now wished she hadn't, as it had given her quite a shock. She then closed her eyes and allowed the ghostly scene to come back to her. 1 minute she was staring across at the church, and then something drew her to the stone wall in front, and there he was, her husband Kevin, with his wavy brown hair and pleasant smiling face. He was wearing his favourite pair of old trousers and fawn polo neck sweater that she'd knitted for him. He looked so real that she was left gasping. He was waving to her and smiling, but she was unprepared to what he did next. He was jerking his thumb down to get her attention to who was sitting beside him. As she looked across at the other figure, her face then drained of all its colour, for she was now looking at Gordon, Joan's son, who was also smiling and waving at her. Her sister then returned to the table with coffee and toasted fruit buns, but Mary was still in shock at what she'd just seen, and then pushed it away and believed she must have imagined it all. After all, she'd only seen Gordon that very morning at her sister's house, looking young, healthy, and alive. Joan looked across at her sister, still concerned, but Mary just told her she had suddenly had a sharp pain, but now it was gone. She was too frightened to tell her sister about the apparitions. Mary did not sleep well that night when the incident at the church continued to replay in her mind. Christmas Eve arrived and Mary packed a few clothes in preparation for a stay at her son's house. Shortly before lunch, Gordon arrived to pick her up in his van, as he'd promised, and loaded up a suitcase along with gifts. Mary thought to herself how considerate he was, and thought one day he would be a good husband and father. That evening, Mary and her sister sat side by side eating snacks and gazed upon the Christmas tree as wind and snow howled outside. They were content just to chat and listen to music. It just so happens that Gordon was out with his friends that evening. But even if he wasn't home, it would not have made much difference, as he was a very quiet person, and they would have forgotten that he was even in the same room. Later that evening, Joan suggested they go out to the local inn, called the White Hart, for the last hour. But the fact that the weather was freezing, Mary would have preferred to have stayed at home in the warm. However, it was Christmas Eve, so she agreed to accompany her sister. They rugged up in warm clothing and braved the elements, and thankfully the inn was not too far away. As they arrived, they found the inn smoky, noisy and packed, but nevertheless were able to find a seat. Joan then commented that her son Gordon must be in the pub somewhere, as she saw his van outside. Mary then looked across the other side of the room and noticed some activity, as a man was trying to get the barman's attention. After he managed to get his message across, he then made his way across the room, but did not initially notice Mary and Joan sitting at the table. As he came past, Joan quickly grabbed his arm and said, "Hello, Terry, is our Gordon with you?" The young man just stared at the two women, and his jaw suddenly dropped. Beads of sweat were trickling down his forehead, and he looked vague and uncertain and panicky. He then said, "Oh, Mrs. Alcaster, can you come outside?" Joan then sensed something was wrong and looked across at her sister with apprehension. Joan then followed the young man, and Mary was close behind her. They'd left their coats on the chair, and an icy blast of cold air met them as they went outside, but at this stage they appeared impervious to the cold. They were both standing at the door of the inn and looked across at a figure sitting against a brick wall, and his head was slumped forward on his chest. They could plainly make out that it was Gordon. All three of them were just standing rigid at the door as the snow fluttered down and the wind blew. Terry was shaking, said that they'd come a couple of hours ago with Sharon and Ellen, and then Gordon said he didn't feel too good. So Terry went outside with him, where Gordon looked terrible. They'd not had much to drink, and then Terry called for an ambulance. She was afraid to walk across to Gordon as he looked unconscious. Joan then walked across to her son, who looked strange and grey-looking. She then knelt down beside her son and gently lifted his head, while at the same time the ambulance could be heard in the distance. Joan could plainly see that the son was not alive, as all three suddenly held their breath. All of a sudden, Joan let out an agonising scream that chilled Mary's blood, and it was too much for her to take. Joan then desperately tried to get air into her son's lungs, but in vain. Mary was now numb with shock as the buzzing returned to her ears, and she fought to stop herself from fainting. Mary was well aware that it was Christmas Eve, and her sister would now share that awful date with her, as the date that each lost a loved one. Mary thought that one day she may be brave enough to tell her sister about her apparition and premonition, where she saw her deceased husband standing next to her nephew Gordon at the church wall.